Thank you. Further corrections, we apologize for the confusion, but I'm neither from Austria nor Australia, but from the United States. But I'm excited to be here today to share this data with you. My two goals would be that give you some information that increases the knowledge you have to go home and apply vaccines in your veterinary practices more effectively, and secondly, not to make you late to lunch. So we'll begin. Credit to my collaborators on this project. Dr. Jan Gothrop conducted the animal phase, securing animals, applying treatments and collecting samples. And Dr. Philip Griebel and his laboratory staff at the Vito in Saskatoon, Canada, did the laboratory phase and analyzing results. We've had a real influx of interest in intranasal vaccines in the United States in the past 8 to 10 years. Actually, we've had intranasal IBR PI3 modified live vaccines for over 40 years, and that vaccine has been used effectively and safely and has established a reputation for being able to circumvent blocking by maternal antibodies, and also to invoke some non-specific antiviral activity through induction of interferon. And so the hope is the new interest in intranasal vaccine development is that we can take advantage of some of those characteristics. However, I think what you'll see today is that not all of these vaccines are the same, so it's important that we examine, do the work to demonstrate their function. So in 2016, our company had approved a new intranasal coronavirus vaccine that was licensed for reduction of enteric disease in calves labeled to be given at 1 week of age. Following that, we also did a field study with the vaccine in a commercial setting where we showed a nice 67% reduction in the incidence of scours in those calves. Of course, our licensure studies, as dictated by the USDA protocols, are all done in colostrum-deprived calves. So the objective of this study was to evaluate the protective mechanisms that were invoked by vaccination, both in the face of maternal antibodies or in colostrum-deprived calves. So we had 56 Holstein calves that were enrolled in the study, ranging from 2 to 5 days of age, both males and females. All calves were screened for persistent infection of BVD and were negative. The calves that were enrolled, randomly enrolled in the MDA positive group, were given a uniform dose of maternal antibodies by using a commercial colostrum replacer, given twice, once relatively quickly after birth and repeated again 8 to 10 hours later. The 24 calves that were randomly assigned to the colostrum-deprived group then were given no colostrum or colostrum replacer. This verifies that we are able to get a very tight grouping of these calves. Just shows that our serum neutralizing antibodies specific to the coronavirus on day 0 or prior to vaccination were very high in the MDA positive group and relatively low then in the MDA negative group. Had one animal there that was not assigned correctly, and by virtue of this testing, we were able to get that animal in the correct group. One of the things I think might be important to note on this slide is that we have a very rigid demarcation here between these two groups that would not be what we'd expect in an on-farm setting where we'd expect to see a nice bell-shaped curve between calves with high levels and low levels of maternal antibody. If you convert this log scale into dilutions, we'd be looking at the differences between a 1 to 16 dilution and about a 1 to 512 dilution. So this is the treatment groups. We had 7 treatment groups. Gets a little confusing, so I'll divide it here into the MDA positive groups. So group 1 is going to be vaccinated with our coronavirus vaccine, 2 mLs intranasally, given 1 time on day 0. Second group also BCV vaccinated, but gets a booster dose at day 21, and then a third group left unvaccinated for controls. In the colostrum-deprived group, we have basically the same pairings here. Group that gets 1 dose of coronavirus vaccine on day 0. Group 7 gets a dose on day 0 and 21, and then another unvaccinated control group. Our last group here is what we used as, I call it a positive control. So with these calves had maternal antibodies, and we vaccinated them with this vaccine I referenced of being about 40 years old. So this is a modified live IBR-PI3 vaccine that has been shown in previous studies to consistently produce both an IgG, an IgA, and an interferon response in the face of maternal antibodies. And so that vaccine was given just once on day 0. We followed the calves out to day 42, and you can see collected serum samples to do viral neutralization titers and also nasal secretions to look at IgA and interferon responses. So these are the results we saw. This would be our IgA response in these calves. We have our IgA titers over here over the 42-day period of the trial. The green lines would be our groups 5 and 7 that were our colostrum-deprived groups that got vaccinated either once or twice. And you can see that by 14 days after vaccination, we saw a significant increase in IgA collected from nasal secretions. And in the group of calves that received the booster vaccination, then we saw a secondary response as well. In contrast, in the 2 red lines here would be our MDA positive groups vaccinated either once or twice, and saw no significant change in IgA response compared to our unvaccinated controls. Also worth noting, I think, on this slide is that the relative, we get relatively quick peaks and then regression of those titers in both of those peaks that you see there. If we looked at the number of calves that responded to initial vaccination on day 0, only 2 of the 14 calves in the MDA positive group compared to 10 of 15 in the colostrum-deprived groups. We looked at individual relationships between beginning colostral titers and their response, and found a very nice tight correlation between day 0 titers, which are on this scale, and the titer then measured 21 days after vaccination. So those calves that had high initial titers, we only had 4. The definition here is anything that had a titer over 100 we called a responder. Only 4 of those calves versus the 10 that responded in the MDA negative group. If we did the same thing in looking at the booster vaccination, we just had 8 calves in those groups, and we can see a better response now. We're further out These calves are 30 days older basically at this time, so now we're getting 50% of those calves to respond. In the colostrum-deprived group, 87%. And if we looked at that relationship again, saw the same thing on the day of boosting, which is day 21. Relative titer here dictated how much of a response we saw at day 35. This is our control group, our positive control, where we used the IBRPI3 vaccine to demonstrate that these calves did have an ability to produce an IgA in the face of maternal antibody, so that we can see here by 21, 28 days after vaccination, we're beginning to see that rise. We also looked at serum titer results, and this would be in our MDA positive group. And if you look at the scale here on the left of those day 0 titers are very high, and so we have it'd be very difficult to see. You'd have to have a very high titer response in order to see much change in that line. But bottom line of the data is that there's no difference between those groups in serum response. If we look at the colostrum-deprived group, now we're down low on the scale at day 0, very little antibody present, and in that environment then we were able to see a fairly strong serum antibody response by day 42. This is also noteworthy in that there are not many intranasal vaccines that we've looked at that are capable of invoking a systemic response here, as well as the local IgA response. This is a look at our interferon response results, and what we see here is that only our group 4 positive control group showed any interferon activity at all, and so none of the BCV vaccinates or controls had any interferon response. So the conclusions from the study is that in this for this response to this intranasal vaccine, we saw a much different response from the MDA positive versus MDA negative calves. The colostrum-deprived calves had a much more robust production of IgA than our colostrum group. The colostrum-deprived calves also showed a strong IgG response to both the initial and secondary vaccination. But we did see that over time, it's not a zero response in this study to vaccination. Some of the calves responded to the first vaccination, more calves responded to the second. And then interferon is not a feature of a coronavirus replication. So part of the discussion becomes that we're tempted to look at these results and say, because there's evidence of maternal blockage of antibody production, that the vaccine would not be effective in the face of maternal antibodies. However, we have the field trial that had already been conducted where we saw efficacy in those colostrum-fed calves. So we have a little bit of a conundrum there to explain. One of the points of discussion would be that this study looked at IgA production from nasal secretions. We didn't look at any gut response, and so while we would expect in a common mucosal system that there is some similarity between what's going on in the nasal mucosa and the gut, those may not be identical, and so may have some protective responses there that are different. The other thing that we've all learned over the years is not to put all our money on a humoral response. We know that there's more effector and protective mechanisms involved than just titers, and so CMI responses have not been evaluated. And lastly, I think importantly, is that it should not be assumed that all intranasal vaccines carry the same properties. we have a favorite saying in our research group that if you haven't done the study, you really don't know the answer. And so I think this points out the value of researching each vaccine and defining what its properties are. With that, I thank you and be happy to answer any questions.